During the final fitting out, O'Kane and radioman First Class James Buckley built a handcrafted target-bearing transmitter from scrap materials. It consisted of a bronze azimuth circle, a boat stuffing box, and a Monel shaft with a slotted fitting to receive binocular hinge pins. This homemade device, mounted on the bridge, would allow Wahoo to conduct night surface attacks, a tactic most submarines had not yet mastered. The crew trained hard, but a mishap during diving drills revealed a flaw in the boat's red lighting. The flood valve wheel for the forward magazine, stripped of its warning color, was inadvertently cracked open. Seawater flooded the magazine before a mess cook noticed a spongy deck hatch and raised the alarm. The magazine was drained and repaired, a close call that taught every hand the price of a single overlooked detail. On the morning of August 12, 1942, Wahoo slipped her moorings at Pier 45 in San Francisco and steamed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, friends and families waving from the observation area. She was bound for Pearl Harbor, 2,000 miles west across the Pacific, with a schedule full of shakedown drills and depth charge indoctrination. The escort destroyer Kilty accompanied her through the first day, and after a trim dive and a chlorine gas drill, Captain Marvin Kennedy released the escort at dusk. For the next 5 days, O'Kane and his assistant navigator wrestled with a self-made crisis. The quartermaster had accidentally torn out 3 days of vital navigation tables from the Air Almanac, forcing them to calculate replacement data by slide rule. Their midnight star fix held true, and on August 18, Wahoo rendezvoused with the destroyer Litchfield precisely on station, a feat that earned a crisp congratulations on precise navigation from the escort. She entered Pearl Harbor on the morning of the 18th, threading past the wreckage of the battleships, her crew standing at quarters with set jaws and stinging eyes. Within a week, she would take on torpedoes, stores, and a fresh load of determination, ready at last to hunt the enemy. On the morning of August 23, 1942, Wahoo slipped her moorings at Pearl Harbor and set course for the Carolines. The crew stood at quarters as the captain conned his submarine past the sunken battleships, a silent reminder of why they were going to war. At the sea buoy, a final trim dive and 2 indoctrinal depth charges from an escort marked the transition from training to combat. By 1000 hours, Wahoo was on patrol, heading west into enemy waters. O'Kane manned the periscope as the approach developed, feeding angles and ranges to the Torpedo Data Computer, TDC, the analog computer that calculated the firing solution for the torpedoes. 3 torpedoes were fired, yet all missed, detonating harmlessly 2 minutes after the target had passed. The magnetic exploders and a mistaken masthead height had cost them the ship, and the lesson was bitter. 8 days later, on the night of September 14th, the crew suffered a far more dangerous failure. Roger Payne, the torpedo officer, requested permission to test the firing valves, and Captain Kennedy gave a casual nod from his bunk. The test sent a live torpedo slamming into the closed outer door of tube number 1. The warhead, partially armed, stuck out from the bow like a loaded fist. The crew scrambled topside with chain falls and wooden wedges, driving the wedges home to prevent the torpedo from detonating. For the rest of the patrol, Wahoo would carry that disabled tube and the knowledge that they had nearly destroyed themselves. On September 19th, under a bright moon, Wahoo found her first real target. A freighter lay stopped, waiting for an escort, presenting a perfect beam shot. 4 torpedoes were fired, 3 missed, but the 4th struck home with a thunderous detonation. The ship took a 50-degree list and sank as 16 depth charges rained down over the next hour and a half. Wahoo survived, and the crew had their first victory. The depth charges came in patterns of 6, shaking the boat and rattling every loose fitting in the hull. George Grider, the engineering officer, fought to maintain depth control as the sea hammered against the pressure hull. Inside the conning tower, the fire control party passed the time by recording each explosion in the log, marking the minutes between salvos. When the last charge detonated and the screws faded, the crew knew they had passed their trial. On October 5th, Wahoo sighted the aircraft carrier Ryujo steaming north of Truk. The captain ordered a submerged approach, but his cautious tactics kept the boat at low speed and shallow periscope depth. The carrier's escorting destroyers were heard long before they were seen, and each periscope observation consumed precious time. The Ryujo drew ahead, her masts shrinking over the horizon and the captain secured from battle stations. In the conning tower, O'Kane plotted a surface end-around on a notepad, but the captain dismissed it. Daylight surface running was too dangerous this close to enemy airfields. Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor on October 17, 1942, with one sinking and a wounded sense of what the war demanded. The crew had learned hard lessons about torpedo failures and cautious command, and the executive officer had begun to wonder whether peacetime doctrine could survive contact with the enemy. That question would be answered within weeks. In Brisbane, a new captain was waiting, a man named Dudley Morton, who would teach Wahoo how to hunt. Wahoo had sailed from Pearl Harbor on November 8th for her second war patrol, bound for the Solomons. By December 10th, she was prowling the waters north of Bougainville when lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. A convoy of 3 freighters in column, escorted by an Asashio-class destroyer, came into view. Captain Kennedy took the boat down for a submerged approach. DeVille Hunter, the signalman serving as periscope assistant, called bearings as the range closed. Kennedy fired 4 torpedoes from 900 yards as Roger Payne called the final setup from the TDC. 3 hit and the lead freighter began sinking. The destroyer answered with depth charges. George Grider fought for depth control through 20 blasts. A waterline in the pump room carried away, but the hull held. 4 days later, on December 14th, the SJ radar broke down again. Buckley had its components spread across the conning tower deck when sound reported the fast screws of a large submarine. The general alarm, which the crew called the Bells of St. Mary's, rang through the boat with the radar still in pieces. The crew tracked the target manually by sound and periscope bearings. The target was a Japanese I-class submarine, surfaced and heading their way. Kennedy fired 3 torpedoes at close range. The first struck just forward of the conning tower. As Wahoo went deep, a deep, muffled whomp echoed through the sea that was the collapsing hull of the enemy boat. O'Kane felt the vibration through the deck plates. Wahoo had sunk her first warship. Wahoo completed her patrol and made for Brisbane, arriving on December 26th. The refit alongside the tender Sperry was routine but thorough. Russell Rao, the chief of the boat, supervised the reloading and the repair of the depth charge damage. 2 sinkings in one patrol, including a warship, had given the crew a new confidence. Yet Captain Kennedy was visibly exhausted, and the division staff had been watching. Forrest Sterling, the ship's yeoman who had joined Wahoo before the 3rd patrol, typed the orders making the change official. Morton came aboard with a simple message for the crew. From now on, Wahoo would stay with every contact until it was on the bottom. The old cautious era was over. On January 16, 1943, Wahoo slipped her moorings in Brisbane and set course for the Palau Islands. The crew had a new captain and a new fire in their bellies. The custom target bearing transmitter that O'Kane and Buckley had built during fitting out was now standard equipment on the bridge, ready for night surface attacks. 8 days later, on the morning of January 24th, Wahoo eased into Wewak Harbor on the north coast of New Guinea. O'Kane was at the periscope, calling angles on what first appeared to be a coast watcher's cooking fire. Chief of the boat Rao took a look through high power and corrected the identification. 2 Chidori-class anti-submarine destroyers lay ahead, their crews still eating breakfast. Morton conned Wahoo into attack position while the destroyers maneuvered at the harbor entrance. One of them turned and headed straight for the submarine's periscope. Its bow wake forming a white V O'Kane held the scope steady as the range dropped to 750 yards. He called the final bearing. Morton shouted, "Fire," and the first torpedo shot down the destroyer's throat. The explosion cracked the enemy's hull just forward of the stack, and steam roared into the sea as the Japanese crew climbed the masts to escape the sinking wreck. Having sunk the destroyer, Morton knew the harbor would be swarming with patrols within hours. He cleared Wewak by nightfall and set a course that would cross the shipping lanes between New Guinea and the Palaus. In the early morning of January 26th, lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. The convoy consisted of a tanker, 2 freighters, and a transport, all heavily loaded and steaming north without a visible escort. Morton did not hesitate. He took Wahoo to the surface and began a high-speed end-around to get ahead of the enemy column. O'Kane manned the TBT, calling bearings as the range closed. By mid-morning, Wahoo had slipped beneath the waves and was tracking the lead freighter at periscope depth. Payne called out the final TDC solution, and Morton gave the order to fire. 3 torpedoes struck the lead ship, and she began to list heavily. The battle did not end with that first sinking. Wahoo surfaced and chased the remaining ships through 14 hours of running gun and torpedo combat. The transport was stopped with 2 hits, and when her troops took to lifeboats, Morton made a swift, hard decision. He ordered the deck gun and machine guns to destroy the boats, knowing every soldier who reached shore could mean an American life lost later. By nightfall, the tanker and both freighters were on the bottom. Wahoo had sunk 4 ships in a single day. In the engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Andrew Lennox hit the circuit breaker reset just in time. He had served with Wahoo since her commissioning and was one of the most experienced engineers in the boat. The jammed stern plane freed as depth charges detonated overhead, and the boat plunged deep. Wahoo leveled off below 300 feet, well past her test depth. The destroyer's screws pounded overhead, and 6 depth charges cracked and whacked around the hull. The boat took no serious damage, but the crew felt every concussion in their bones. Morton waited 30 minutes, then brought Wahoo back to periscope depth. The destroyer had departed, convinced the submarine had been destroyed. Morton surfaced and set course for Fayas Island, where he planned to reconnoiter a Japanese phosphorite works. On the way, the crew spotted a small freighter, but all torpedoes had been expended. Morton settled for taking photographs through the periscope before turning Wahoo toward Pearl Harbor. The patrol was over, but the legend was just beginning. Wahoo crossed the international dateline on February 2nd, giving the crew 2 Tuesdays and plenty of time to clean the boat and prepare the patrol report. Sterling typed the captain's narrative while O'Kane tallied the enemy ships sunk. Morton added a personal paragraph commending every man aboard, singling out O'Kane as cool and deliberate under fire. On February 7, 1943, Wahoo made her rendezvous with the escort destroyer Litchfield and entered Pearl Harbor. The boat was flying an Australian broom, lashed to the top of the periscope shears, bristles pointing skyward. The signal was unmistakable, a clean sweep. Morton had sunk 1 destroyer, 1 tanker, 2 freighters, and 1 transport in a single patrol, plus the boats of the transport. The pier was packed with officers, dock workers, and a brass band playing the Hawaiian war chant. Admiral Halsey's message of congratulations was already waiting. The broom became the most photographed object in the harbor that day, and the crew of Wahoo walked off the boat as heroes. Morton's aggressive tactics had been vindicated, and every man aboard knew that the war in the Pacific had just found a new kind of predator. Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor in early March for her 4th war patrol, bound for the East China and Yellow Seas. The crew carried the confidence of 3 successful patrols, but Captain Morton knew that each mission demanded fresh proof of their methods. On the morning of April 10th, lookouts spotted the mast of a large transport emerging from the haze near the Chinese coast. Morton conned Wahoo to periscope depth as O'Kane tracked the target through the scope. The ship was the Sewa Maru, a 6,000-ton transport steaming without an escort. Morton held the approach steady as the range closed to 1,500 yards. O'Kane called the final bearing and Payne's TDC solution locked in. 3 torpedoes leaped from the forward tubes, their wakes converging on the transport's hull. 2 struck home beneath the bridge, and a 3rd slammed into her engine room. The Sewa Maru listed hard to port and began sinking by the stern. Before the crew could celebrate, the periscope revealed an escort destroyer charging toward Wahoo's position, and Morton ordered the dive. Depth charges walked across the ocean above, but Wahoo slipped beneath a thermal layer, a boundary of colder water that reflects sonar waves, hiding the submarine from enemy echo ranging, and escaped undamaged. 5 days later, on the forenoon of April 18th, Wahoo surfaced near a small trawler spotted at the edge of a rain squall. Morton decided to conserve torpedoes and ordered the deck gun manned. The trawler was no match for the 4-inch gun. After 5 rounds, she was on fire and settling. Before the gun crew could secure their piece, a larger freighter appeared over the horizon, and Morton ordered a surface pursuit. As Wahoo closed to gun range, the freighter opened fire with a small caliber weapon mounted on her stern, and splashes kicked up close to the submarine's hull. During the surface pursuit, a 20-millimeter barrel jammed and exploded, spraying fragments across the gun mount. Fireman Henry Glinsky lost part of a toe, and torpedoman's mate Chester Tyler took a piece of metal in the shoulder. Pharmacist's mate First Class Jerome Lindy, the boat's veteran medic, worked with wire cutters borrowed from the pump room, removed splinters, and performed field surgery as the boat continued operations. Wahoo continued patrolling in the East China Sea for another month, sinking additional ships and surviving a depth charge attack on May 20th. With torpedoes expended and the crew worn, Morton set course for Midway Atoll, arriving in early June for refit alongside the tender. The damaged 20-millimeter barrel was replaced, and on June 23rd, with Morton in command and O'Kane still as executive officer, Wahoo departed Midway for the Kuril Islands and the home waters of Honshu, her fifth war patrol. The hunting grounds north of Japan were cold and often fog-bound, but the merchant traffic was steady. Morton found his targets with the same aggressive patience that had defined the third and fourth patrols. On two separate occasions within the same week, Wahoo executed textbook periscope attacks, one against a freighter steaming alone, the other against a transport hugging the coast. Both ships went down with well-placed torpedoes, and no escort was able to pin Wahoo down long enough to deliver a serious counterattack. By mid-August, Wahoo was back at Pearl Harbor, the mission accomplished and the crew exhausted but proud. The Fifth Patrol had been businesslike and efficient, a testament to how far the boat and her men had come since the tentative First Patrol under Kennedy. But a change was coming. O'Kane received orders to report as prospective commanding officer of a new submarine, then building, the USS Tang. O'Kane spent his final days aboard Wahoo not in idle farewells, but in methodical turnover. He reviewed every fire control procedure with the officers who would remain, walked the new executive officer through the nuances of Morton's approach doctrine, and ensured that the navigation records and patrol logs were in order. When he finally gathered his sea bag and stepped off the boat, he left behind a submarine that had been sharpened into one of the most lethal hunters in the Pacific Fleet. Among those who packed their gear and departed was Roger Payne after 5 grueling patrols. George Grider had already transferred before the 5th Patrol, but would return to serve as executive officer on the 6th. They left behind a wardroom that would have to rebuild its chemistry from scratch. Morton made it clear to his new team that the standard had been set: aggressive, relentless, and always on the offensive. The new executive officer, a lieutenant commander with solid submarine experience, spent his first days studying O'Kane's logbooks and the patrol reports from the past 4 missions. By the time Wahoo cast off her lines for the 6th Patrol, the crew was as ready as they would ever be, though no one could know that this would be the beginning of the end. In the final days of August, Wahoo slipped out of Pearl Harbor for her 6th War Patrol. Captain Morton stood on the bridge with a new executive officer at his side, the wardroom rebuilt after losing O'Kane and Payne to new commands, though Grider had returned to serve as executive officer for the 6th Patrol. The boat carried the same aggressive spirit, but the faces had changed, and the Sea of Japan would test them all. They crossed the shipping lanes north of the home islands, hunting in waters that grew more dangerous with every passing month. The crew knew the enemy had grown sharper, the escorts more numerous, the air patrols more relentless. They went anyway. Wahoo found her targets inside the Sea of Japan, picking through the narrow passages that led to the Empire's vital supply lines. Morton drove the boat hard, and the new team proved they had learned from the veterans who came before. In 2 sharp periscope attacks, they put a freighter and a transport to the bottom, the torpedoes running true, the escorts arriving too late to pin the submarine down. Wahoo cleared the area under cover of darkness, the diesels thrumming as she headed for open water. The crew allowed themselves a quiet pride in another job done, but the tension never fully left the boat. They had been lucky, and they knew luck does not last forever. Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor in the 3rd week of September, the mission accomplished, but the rest brief and hurried. The tender crews replaced worn fittings and topped off the magazines, while Morton studied the intelligence reports with a new gravity. The Sea of Japan was tightening. The enemy had learned to coordinate depth charges with air patrols, and more than one American submarine had failed to return from those waters. Morton said nothing of this to the crew, but the men saw the maps on the wardroom table, the circled danger zones, the patrol tracks that went in but never came out. They understood. On the first days of October, Wahoo stood out of Pearl Harbor for the 7th time. The boat slipped past the channel buoys at dawn, the bridge manned by lookouts who had been with Morton since his first patrol in command. The new executive officer stood beside the captain, quiet and watchful, while the diesels pushed the boat toward the setting sun. They were bound again for the Sea of Japan, that cold and dangerous basin where the enemy waited with growing skill and fury. The men went about their duties with the practiced calm of professionals, but the smiles were fewer now. They knew the odds were shortening. Wahoo transited the Tsushima Strait under cover of darkness, slipping past the patrol craft that guarded the narrow entrance to the Sea of Japan. Inside, the hunting was good. Morton found a convoy on the morning of October 11th, loaded freighters escorted by a pair of destroyers and a covering aircraft overhead. He took the boat down to periscope depth and began the approach, the same methodical, aggressive tactics that had served him so well before. But the escorts were alert. A destroyer turned toward the periscope before Morton could fire, and the aircraft spotted the feather of the scope at the same moment. The trap had closed before the first torpedo left the tube. The depth charges came in patterns, walking across Wahoo's track with devastating accuracy. The escort commander knew his work, coordinating the airdrop charges with the destroyer's depth settings to box the submarine in. Morton took the boat deep, passing 300 feet, then 4, the hull groaning under the strain. The lights flickered and a saltwater line cracked somewhere aft, flooding the bilges with a steady, sickening trickle. The plainsmen fought to keep the boat level while the chief of the boat, Russell Rao, ordered every available man to the pumps. But the charges kept coming, and the enemy knew exactly where they were. An aerial depth charge detonated close aboard port side, just forward of the conning tower. The shock cracked a main seawater line in the control room, and the flood valve jammed open. Water poured into the boat faster than the pumps could clear it. Morton ordered emergency blow, and Wahoo rose toward the surface, the hiss of high-pressure air drowning out every other sound as the crew braced against the steep up-angle. The boat broached, the decks awash, and the Japanese destroyer was waiting. The first shell struck the conning tower fairwater, and the second tore through the pressure hull just forward of the after engine room. Wahoo was finished as a fighting ship. Morton gave the order to abandon ship, but there was no time. The destroyer closed to point-blank range, its guns hammering the crippled submarine while the aircraft circled overhead, machine guns stitching the deck. The bow went under first, then the bridge, the sea pouring through the gaping holes in Wahoo's side. The boat slid beneath the waves with a roar of trapped air, the men still inside her, and the Japanese crews watched the bubbles rise until they stopped. The official report, later recovered from enemy archives, noted the depth and position of the sinking, confirming that no survivors emerged. Wahoo was gone, and with her Commander Dudley Morton and every soul aboard. In the months that followed, the Navy listed Wahoo as overdue and presumed lost, the families left to wait in a silence that already carried the answer. Captain Kennedy, who had been detached before the 3rd Patrol, served on submarine staffs and survived the war. Lieutenant Grider later commanded the submarine Flasher, survived, and after the war served as a U.S. congressman. Lieutenant Payne commanded another submarine and survived. Signalman Hunter, Yeoman Sterling, and Chief Machinist's mate Lennox had all transferred to new assignments before the final patrol and survived. Radioman James Buckley, however, remained aboard Wahoo and was lost with the ship. The final tally stood at 25 enemy ships sunk, a record that placed Wahoo among the most successful submarines of the Pacific War. The Presidential Unit Citation was awarded to the boat and to her name, a pennant that would fly from any future vessel bearing that call. The men who built that record, the signalmen and machinists, the cooks and radiomen, the officers who conned her into battle were gone, but the standard they set remained. Richard O'Kane, commanding the submarine Tang, received word of Wahoo's loss while at sea. He carried that grief through every subsequent patrol, and after the war he wrote the definitive account of the boat's 7 patrols, naming every man who served and honoring every man who died. O'Kane wrote not as a distant historian, but as a shipmate, and in those pages the voices of the crew speak again across the decades. The Presidential Unit Citation pennant, tattered and faded, rests today in a frame, but the names carved on the memorial at Pearl Harbor need no flag to mark their courage. They are remembered. If you have family stories from the Pacific War or memories passed down from those who served in the submarine service, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments. We read everyone. If you would like to see more documentaries like this one, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us continue telling the stories of the men and women who served. Thank you for listening.